The Galactic Armada moved through the cold expanse of the star system with calculated precision, its massive warships cruising in perfect formation across the vast black ocean of space. Each vessel was a testament to centuries of technological advancement and military dominance, their hulls gleaming like polished obsidian, the collective might of dozens of alien races bound together in a single unstoppable force. The Armada's mission was simple: to explore new worlds, to establish new colonies, and to crush any opposition that dared to challenge their supremacy. When a faint signal flickered on the edge of their sensors, their attention was drawn to it. The transmission came from a remote sector of space, an area marked as uncharted and unexplored. The Armada had no intention of wasting resources on a minor anomaly, but protocol dictated they investigate such disturbances without hesitation. The fleet shifted course toward the source of the signal. At first, the officers and commanders believed it was nothing more than a malfunction, or some relic of a long-dead civilization. They expected to find nothing of significance. But as they drew closer, the transmission became clearer, a series of short bursts of encrypted data, followed by a faint signal repeating over and over. The message was almost too simple. It was a direct challenge addressed to the Armada in a language that none of them had heard before, but one that was unmistakably human. The Galactic Empire had encountered many species before, but never had they faced humans, and no one had ever seen a ship from Earth. It was a species still considered primitive by the galaxy's standards. Their technology was crude, their weapons outdated, and their ships barely more than fragile shells compared to the might of the Armada. But as the fleet neared the source of the transmission, they saw something that made them hesitate. A small ship no larger than a frigate drifted in the emptiness, ahead, its hull pockmarked with old battle scars. It was an unassuming craft by every measure, nothing more than a relic of a time long past. But something about it felt wrong. A quiet tension filled the command deck of the lead vessel. As the fleet drew within range of the human ship, they could see its profile clearly now. Despite its obvious age, the human warship was moving with an eerie sense of purpose, its engines humming in a steady pulse that felt strangely methodical. It wasn't just drifting, it was waiting for them to arrive, waiting for what was next. The Armada's admiral sat back in his command chair, watching the small ship on the screen. His species had conquered entire star systems. Without breaking a sweat, they had annihilated fleets of warriors whose names were feared across the galaxy, and now they were confronted with a single human ship. Not only had they never encountered humanity, but the ship seemed to be waiting for them to make the first move. His crew murmured among themselves. Questions and doubts crept in, but the admiral silenced them with a single wave of his hand. He had seen this before. An alien race's first encounter with the might of the Armada was always met with hesitation and fear. They would see the superior force and back down, just as they all had before. The admiral smiled, his teeth sharp and proud. Surely this human ship would be no different, and they would crush it just as they had done so many times before. Without so much as a second thought, the Armada was poised for victory once more. But there was something in the silence that stretched between them and the human vessel, a feeling of unease that none of them could shake. The silence between the two ships lingered like a thick fog, and the admiral's confidence began to waver ever so slightly. He could feel the weight of his crew's uneasy glances as they waited for orders. The small human ship remained eerily still in the distance, its lights blinking softly, as if it were nothing more than an old ghost ship. But something in the back of his mind nagged at him, urging caution. The human ship was far too quiet, too still, too controlled for something so insignificant. The admiral pushed the thought away and gave the order to establish communication. A low hum filled the command deck as the fleet's communication array activated. The screen flickered to life, showing the face of a human captain, his expression calm and unreadable, his eyes sharp beneath the weight of a battle-worn brow. The man's uniform was simple, no grand decorations, no ornate insignia, just the bare essentials of a military leader who had seen his share of war. The admiral's eyes narrowed. He was expecting some form of fear or hesitation, but instead there was only an unsettling calm in the human's demeanor. "This is Captain Elias Hawke of the U.S. Vanguard." The human's voice crackled through the speakers, smooth and controlled, not the voice of someone afraid, but of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "I am transmitting a direct challenge to the Galactic Armada. You are not welcome here." The audacity of the message stunned the admiral for a moment, and his gaze flickered over the faces of his officers. None of them knew how to respond. The transmission was received in silence. The captain's tone had been so matter-of-fact, so sure of itself, as though he was speaking to an equal or perhaps even an inferior. "What is this insolence?" The admiral growled, his voice low, his words coated with disdain. "You stand alone and dare to challenge the might of the Galactic Armada." The human captain didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, his expression unchanged. "I am not afraid of your fleet," he said simply, "and neither are the people of Earth." The words hit like a slap, but it was the tone that truly rattled the admiral. He had faced countless enemies and heard every manner of defiance, but there was something in the captain's voice that defied the logic of the situation. The admiral had expected to hear terror or desperate pleading. Instead, he heard resolve and unshakable belief that this single human vessel could do something against a force that had shattered entire civilizations. The fleet around them waited for the admiral to respond, but instead he stared at the screen, his thoughts racing as he tried to reconcile the situation. This human ship was not acting like any other race they had encountered. It was not running, it was not begging, it was not even afraid. It was standing its ground, unflinching. A small part of the admiral's mind wondered if they were making a mistake. The thought was quickly dismissed. He would crush this human ship as he had crushed so many before. He opened his mouth to give the order to fire, but before the command could leave his lips, the human captain spoke again, his voice steady and clear. "We are not like any enemies you have faced before." The words cut through the tension like a blade, and for a fleeting moment, the admiral felt a cold shiver down his spine. The cold shiver that ran down the admiral's spine was quickly buried under layers of arrogance and contempt. He had no time for hesitation, not when the fate of the Armada rested on his shoulders. This human captain's words were nothing but bravado, a final desperate attempt to sow doubt before the inevitable end. The admiral's jaw tightened, his hand hovering over the command console. "Engage them," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. At his command, the massive warships of the Armada sprang into motion. The fleet formed up in a tight formation, their enormous weapons primed and ready. The human ship, the U.S. Vanguard, was outclassed in every conceivable way. Its hull was pitted with signs of age and battle. Its energy readings were weak compared to the advanced fleets of the Armada, and its weapons were no match for the firepower of the alien dreadnoughts. It was, by all standards, a relic. But the admiral knew better than to underestimate any enemy. As the Armada's ships closed in, the human captain remained unnervingly calm. The Vanguard didn't move. Instead, it seemed to wait, as if daring the Armada to make the first move. The tension on the command deck of the lead vessel was palpable, each officer aware of the weight of the moment. The screens displayed the Vanguard, its silhouette appearing small and fragile next to the colossal ships of the Armada. Then, without warning, the human warship's engines flared to life. The Vanguard's movement was swift, almost impossible to track. It darted like a predator with deadly precision, dodging the first volley of fire from the Armada's capital ships. The shots streaked through the void, but the human vessel vanished into the shadows, seemingly absorbed by the blackness of space. The admiral's eyes widened. How had it moved so quickly? "Fire again," he barked, his voice now tinged with urgency. But the human ship was already back, unleashing a barrage of energy blasts that struck with surgical precision. The energy shields of the Armada warships shuddered, crackling under the unexpected assault. A series of explosions erupted across the hull of the lead dreadnought, the ship groaning as its outer layers of armor buckled. The admiral's hands tightened into fists. The Vanguard's attacks weren't just random. They were calculated, targeting weak points in the Armada's defenses with pinpoint accuracy. It wasn't the raw power of the blast that was most disturbing, but the way the human ship seemed to anticipate every movement, every weakness in the Armada's formation. It was as if the ship was reading their tactics, countering their every move before they even made it. The admiral's mind raced, trying to comprehend how a single outdated ship could be so unpredictable, so dangerous. "Deploy interceptors," The admiral ordered, his voice now laced with frustration. "We will not be outmaneuvered by this primitive vessel." Swarming from the flanks of the Armada's flagship, hundreds of smaller fighter ships shot toward the Vanguard, their engines roaring as they closed the distance. The fighters were fast, agile, and designed for speed, exactly what the Vanguard should have been vulnerable to. But once again, the human warship defied expectations. In a single sweeping motion, it slipped into a tight evasive maneuver, weaving through the mass of oncoming fighters with impossible fluidity. The Armada's interceptors attempted to lock on, but the Vanguard's evasive actions were too erratic, too unpredictable. One by one, the smaller ships were destroyed in blinding bursts of light as the Vanguard unleashed its full arsenal. Energy pulses exploded in the midst of the fighters, leaving nothing but debris in their wake. The human warship moved like a living creature, a predator that knew how to strike where it hurt, dismantling the Armada's assault with ease. "Impossible," the admiral muttered under his breath, his mind reeling as he watched his fleet's forces being torn apart by a single human ship. The Vanguard was not just fighting. It was toying with them, exploiting their every mistake, their every weakness. The admiral's pride, once a source of overwhelming confidence, now began to crumble. The battle had shifted from one of superiority to a chaotic struggle for survival. The once proud Armada fleet, which had never encountered a foe capable of standing up to their might, was now in disarray. The Vanguard was not merely surviving, it was dominating. It wasn't just about the technology anymore, not about the weapons or the shields. It was something deeper, something that made the human warship seem almost alive. The way it moved, the way it anticipated every strike, it felt like the Vanguard was reading the Armada's every thought. The admiral, his face flushed with growing frustration, slammed his fist onto the command console. The screen in front of him flickered with data, showing the growing list of casualties among his fleet. Several warships had been disabled or outright destroyed, their hulks now drifting lifelessly in space. The Vanguard, though small and unassuming compared to the dreadnoughts around it, seemed to thrive in the chaos. It was everywhere at once, a blur of motion, its weapons striking at the weak points of the Armada with ruthless precision. "Reinforcements," the admiral growled, teeth gritted. "Send the dreadnoughts forward. We end this now." It was a desperate measure. The massive dreadnoughts were the Armada's last hope, their ultimate weapon, capable of unleashing destructive firepower capable of vaporizing entire fleets. But as the enormous ships moved into position, the Vanguard didn't hesitate. The human warship darted into the heart of the dreadnoughts, diving between them with unnatural speed. The Armada's fighters tried to converge on it, but the Vanguard was already gone, streaking past the fleet with pinpoint precision, weaving through the massive warships as though it had the agility of a fighter jet. Energy blasts lit up the darkness of space as the Vanguard fired relentlessly at the largest dreadnought, its shots striking at the ship's massive engines. One by one, the ships began to falter, their shields failing, their weapon systems damaged by the onslaught. The admiral's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched the Vanguard effortlessly dismantle the very ships that had once seemed invincible. It was as though the human ship could read the battlefield, predicting every move, every countermeasure. No matter how much the Armada fought back, it was always one step behind. "Focus fire on the Vanguard," the admiral shouted, his voice filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "We cannot lose to this human ship." The fleet responded, a volley of energy blasts surging through space, directed at the elusive human warship. But the Vanguard didn't just evade. It danced between the strikes, its movements almost instinctual, its agility seeming to defy all logic. It wasn't simply avoiding the fire. It was making the Armada waste its energy, forcing them to expend ammunition on empty space. And in the brief moments when the Vanguard did strike, its hits were surgical, not wasting a single shot. The human captain, Elias Hawke, watched the devastation unfold from the command bridge, his face betraying no emotion. His crew, however, could feel the rising tension. The battle had reached a boiling point. Despite the overwhelming odds, they had held their ground. The Vanguard had taken down the Armada's most powerful ships, and the enemy was beginning to retreat. But Hawk knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. This wasn't a victory yet, just a reprieve. The Admiral would regroup, and the fleet would come back stronger. "Prepare for a final strike," Hawk ordered. His crew snapped into action, manning their stations as the ship's targeting systems recalibrated. Every member of the Vanguard's crew had been in the trenches before, and they knew how to execute under pressure. This was what they had trained for. On the other side of the battlefield, the Admiral watched his fleet falter. The dreadnoughts were still formidable, but they were now isolated, surrounded by debris and the wreckage of their own fallen comrades. The Armada's commander struggled to maintain his composure, his mind racing to formulate a plan, but nothing came to him. The Vanguard had broken their formation, shattered their defenses, and now it seemed as if they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. The human warship, a single vessel, had taken down more than half of their fleet, and still, it pressed on, relentless. The Admiral's mind churned with disbelief. "How is this possible?" he muttered, staring at the Vanguard as it circled above the carnage, ready for the next move. In the cold, vast silence of space, the Armada was beginning to realize that they were not the invincible force they thought they were. They were not the top of the galaxy's food chain. Not anymore. The humans had just delivered a reminder of what it meant to be underestimated. As the battle dragged on, the Armada's commanders began to exchange nervous glances, their once confident demeanor replaced with uncertainty. Ships that had once been powerful symbols of their species' dominance were now burning wrecks or limping through space, unable to defend themselves from the relentless onslaught of the human warship. The Vanguard's tactics had shattered the Armada's plans with an ease that none of them had anticipated. The Admiral, now grim and unrelenting, continued to issue orders, his voice tight with frustration. But his commands were met with resistance and hesitation among his officers. They were not used to failure. They were not used to this kind of fight. Meanwhile, on the Vanguard, Captain Elias Hawk remained composed as ever, his eyes flicking across the displays as the situation unfolded. The human warship had taken significant damage, the shields barely holding on after hours of brutal combat. The crew had been pushed to their limits, but they were still standing, still holding on. Their unity and determination were unlike anything Hawk had seen in his years of service. The spirit of humanity, as he had come to understand it, was something that could not be measured by firepower alone. It was something deeper, something that no amount of superior technology could replicate. Hawk's mind was sharp, his thoughts laser-focused on the task at hand. The Admiral's fleet was still formidable, and the Vanguard could not afford to take them lightly. The next few minutes would determine whether they would be able to finish this fight or be overwhelmed by the sheer size and power of the Armada. He had to make the right decisions. Fast. "Status report," he barked. "Shields at 30%, came the reply. "Hull integrity compromised on sections 4 through 6. Weapon systems are still operational, but we're running low on energy reserves." "How many dreadnoughts are left?" Hawk pressed. 3, the officer replied, eyes scanning the readouts. "The rest have either been destroyed or are drifting, unable to fight." Hawk nodded, taking a deep breath. It wasn't a victory yet. Not by a long shot. The remaining dreadnoughts were still a threat. The Armada still outnumbered them, even if they were disorganized and severely damaged. But Hawk knew something the Admiral didn't: the tenacity of humanity. The refusal to give up, no matter the odds. It wasn't just about the ship or the weapons or the technology. It was the crew, every man and woman aboard the Vanguard, willing to fight and die for each other. "Prepare to engage the last of the dreadnoughts," Hawk said, his voice low but steady. "We end this now." On the bridge, his crew sprang into action, pushing the ship to its limits. As the Vanguard streaked toward the remaining dreadnoughts, it darted and weaved, avoiding the incoming blasts with impossible speed. The enemy fire lashed out, but the human ship moved like water through a storm, slipping past the fire with uncanny precision. The remaining dreadnoughts were now desperate, firing everything they had in a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide. But the Vanguard was faster, smarter. Hawk had studied the weaknesses of every ship in the Armada's fleet, knew their blind spots, their critical points. He'd watched their patterns, learned their tactics, and now he was exploiting them. One by one, the dreadnoughts began to falter. Shields cracked under the concentrated barrage from the Vanguard's weapons. The smaller warships launched every possible countermeasure, but it was too little, too late. With a calculated strike, the Vanguard's weapons tore through the nearest dreadnought's vulnerable engines, sending it into a fiery spiral. The explosion was massive, a brief but blinding flash that lit up the surrounding darkness. The second dreadnought didn't fare much better, its defensive systems overwhelmed by the precise targeting of the human warship. Hawk's eyes locked onto the final dreadnought, the last ship standing between them and victory. It was alone now, surrounded by the wreckage of its comrades. The once proud Armada was crumbling, and the final act of this battle would be a testament to humanity's resilience. "Deploy all remaining fighters," Hawk ordered, his voice calm but resolute. "Give them everything we've got." The last of the Vanguard's fighters shot into space, streaking toward the remaining dreadnought. They were smaller, less powerful, but they had one thing the Armada didn't: the human spirit. The final battle was about to unfold, and this time, there would be no escape for the Galactic Armada. They had underestimated the resolve of humanity, and now they would see exactly what that meant. The Vanguard moved in for the kill, its weapons charged, its crew united in purpose. The Armada had never faced anything like this before, and they wouldn't know how to fight it. Not until it was too late. As the final dreadnought tried to regroup, the weight of its losses hung heavy in the void. The vast majority of the Armada's fleet had already been reduced to debris or disabled beyond repair. The few remaining ships, including the dreadnought now facing the Vanguard, were battered, their once pristine hulls torn by repeated strikes. The remaining commanders and officers were scrambling, desperate to regroup, but they were fighting an enemy that had proven far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. The Vanguard, however, was not finished. Even with its energy reserves dwindling, even with its shields barely functional, it was still alive, still hunting. Captain Elias Hawk stood resolute on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the lone dreadnought before him. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about proving something. "Ready all weapon systems," Hawk ordered, his voice calm but heavy with the gravity of the moment. "We end this." The crew moved with the practiced efficiency born of countless battles. The last of the Vanguard's fighter ships, battered but still functional, buzzed around the dreadnought, harassing its defense systems, drawing its fire away from the approaching warship. Every shot fired from the dreadnought missed as the fighters dodged and weaved with the agility the larger vessel could never hope to replicate. It was the final effort of the Armada's last hope, but even that was beginning to fail. The dreadnought's captain, a seasoned warrior from a species known for its ruthless precision, watched as his fleet was destroyed. He could feel his grasp on the situation slipping. His ship was surrounded, cornered. Yet still, he clung to the belief that his superior technology would carry them through. His fleet had obliterated planets, crushed rebellions, but this was different. The human warship had shown him something he'd never experienced, a defiance so absolute, so brutal, that it threatened to break the very foundation of his pride. On the other side of the battlefield, Hawk's focus narrowed. He knew the dreadnought was preparing for one last desperate stand. Its remaining weaponry was now charged to maximum, its shields reinforced as much as possible, and its engines pushed beyond their limits. It would try to make a final, fatal strike, an all-or-nothing effort to end the fight in one decisive blow. But Hawk was prepared. He had anticipated this move. "Boost power to the forward shields," Hawk ordered, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. Target their main weapons array and fire on my mark. The battle for supremacy had now become a high-stakes game of strategy, with both sides knowing that one misstep could lead to total annihilation. The dreadnought's captain believed this final strike would take down the human vessel, but the human crew had other plans. The Vanguard, moving with deadly precision, slid into the gap left by the Armada's frantic final push. The dreadnought opened fire first, its weapons screaming through the darkness, each shot charged with enough force to turn a planet to dust. But they missed by a narrow margin, and that was all the Vanguard needed. With incredible speed, the human warship darted toward the dreadnought, narrowly avoiding its deadly barrage. The space between them closed rapidly, the silence of the void filled only by the hum of energy and the thrum of battle. The Vanguard unleashed its final offensive in one crushing strike, its weapons tearing into the dreadnought's shields with focused intensity. The massive vessel shuddered as explosions racked its hull, sending shockwaves through the emptiness. The dreadnought's defenses crumpled beneath the human warship's assault. The last of its shields flickered out, and in that final moment, the human ship did what no one thought it could. It pierced the dreadnought's core. The ship's central reactor, overloaded and unshielded, exploded in a cataclysmic burst of energy. The resulting shockwave lit up the dark canvas of space, sending a ripple of destruction through the nearby debris. What had once been a symbol of the Armada's indomitable power was now nothing more than a floating tomb of twisted metal. On the Vanguard, the crew let out a collective breath as the explosions faded into silence. For a moment, the ship floated in the aftermath, the hum of the engines the only sound filling the bridge. They had done it. Against all odds, against a fleet that outnumbered them 10-1. They had fought and won. Captain Hawk stood still, his eyes sweeping over the wreckage on the view screen. It was difficult to feel elation in this moment. He knew the cost had been high, lives had been lost, and the Vanguard itself had taken a beating. But as the final remnants of the Armada's fleet scattered, Hawk allowed himself one fleeting moment of quiet pride. Humanity had just delivered the message. They were not to be underestimated. "We did it," he whispered to no one in particular. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was a recognition that, against all odds, humanity had proven that their will, their spirit, could never be extinguished. The Galactic Armada, for the first time in their history, had encountered a force they could not conquer, and it had come from a single human warship. The silence after the destruction of the last dreadnought hung in the cold expanse of space, a silence that felt almost unnatural after the chaos of battle. The Vanguard drifted among the shattered remnants of the Armada, its crew exhausted but resolute. Outside, the debris from the battle floated like a grim reminder of what had just transpired, of the overwhelming force that had come to their doorstep and been shattered by a single human ship. The fleet of the Galactic Armada had been decimated, but the war was far from over. On the bridge, Captain Elias Hawk stood still, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the wreckage. The gravity of what had just happened was beginning to settle in. They had won, yes, but at a great cost. The Vanguard was damaged, its shields and weapons systems barely functioning. The crew had pushed themselves beyond their limits, and many of them would need medical attention as soon as the battle was over. There was no time to relax, no time to savor the victory. The Armada's defeat would send shockwaves throughout the galaxy, but the war, their war, was still unfolding. "We did it, Captain," Commander Jenna Blake, his second in command, said, her voice laced with exhaustion, but tinged with something else. Relief, perhaps. She stood beside him, her eyes scanning the tactical display. "We've only scratched the surface," Hawk replied, his voice steady but heavy. "We've taken down one part of their fleet, but there's more out there. They won't stop because we've destroyed a few ships." Blake nodded, her expression hardening. "They'll come for us again. But they've been put on notice. They'll know that humanity won't go down quietly." Hawk turned to face her, his gaze sharp. "The Armada isn't the real threat. It's the ideology they represent. The belief that any race that stands in their way can be erased without consequence. We've just shown them that it isn't true, but we can't expect them to accept defeat. I know, Blake said softly, but we've made our mark. This isn't just a victory for us. It's a victory for every race they've conquered, and it will inspire them. There was a pause as Hawk processed her words. He knew she was right. The defeat of the Armada was more than just a military victory. It was a statement, a declaration that humanity, against all odds, had the strength and will to fight back. It would be a symbol of hope for those who had suffered under the Armada's oppressive rule, and it would shake the foundations of the galaxy in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. But the war was far from over, and though their battle had been won, Hawk knew they needed to be prepared for what came next. Send a message to the fleet, Hawk ordered. We need to prepare for the next phase. We can't afford to let them regroup. Blake nodded, turning to the communications console. Hawk's eyes remained fixed on the view outside, his mind racing through the implications of their victory. The Armada had underestimated them. They had come expecting an easy conquest, expecting humanity to fold under pressure. Instead, they had been met with something they hadn't planned for, something that was beyond their capacity to control. As Blake sent the orders, Hawk's mind flashed back to the moments before the battle, when he had stood at the helm, facing down a force that outclassed them in every way. He had known then, deep in his gut, that they had to succeed. There was no other option. There were too many lives at stake, too many futures hanging in the balance. If they lost here, if the Armada crushed the Vanguard and its crew, humanity would be silenced, eradicated. The galaxy would have one less voice to challenge its oppressive rulers, and that wasn't an option. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, and Blake looked up from her console, her expression serious. Captain, we're receiving a transmission from the remaining Armada command ships. They're requesting Parley. Hawk raised an eyebrow. The idea of negotiating with the very force that had sought to destroy them felt almost absurd, but his instinct told him to listen. They had defeated the Armada's main force, but this was a war, not just a battle, and there would be more than just military strength to consider. Put it through, Hawk said, his voice unwavering. The screen flickered, and soon a figure appeared before them, a high-ranking officer of the Galactic Armada, her face cold and composed. She was older, her features sharp with age and experience, and there was an unsettling calm in her eyes as she addressed Hawk. Captain Hawk, she began, her voice clipped and authoritative. You have destroyed our fleet, and yet you have only delayed the inevitable. We offer you a choice. Surrender now, and your people will be spared. Resist, and you will face the full might of the Armada. This war is far from over. Hawk's gaze never wavered. You don't understand, he said slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It's not about surrendering. You've just found out what happens when you underestimate humanity. The figure on the screen stiffened, her eyes narrowing. This will not end the way you hope, Captain. We will return, and when we do, you will be crushed. We'll be waiting, Hawk replied, his voice steady and full of resolve. The transmission cut off, but the message was clear. This was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and the Armada would return. But humanity had shown them something they would never forget. They had shown the galaxy that they were not to be trifled with. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The Vanguard lingered in the aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the debris of the Armada's fleet. It was a moment of temporary peace, but Hawk knew it was fleeting. The Armada had been dealt a crushing blow, but they had never been ones to back down. The transmission had made that clear. Despite their defeat, they would not simply disappear into the darkness. They would regroup, rebuild, and return with vengeance in mind. But humanity had learned something in this battle. They were no longer the underdogs in this war. They were now a force to be reckoned with, and they would fight with every ounce of their strength to protect their future. On the bridge, the mood was somber. There were no celebrations, no victory parades. The crew of the Vanguard had survived, but at a great cost. The ship itself had taken severe damage, and many of the crew had been injured in the heat of battle. Still, the morale was high. They had faced down the greatest military power the galaxy had ever seen and emerged victorious. The message had been sent, not just to the Armada, but to all those who thought humanity could be easily crushed. They were no longer to be underestimated. Hawk stood before the command console, staring at the shattered remains of the Armada's fleet scattered across the dark void. The destruction was almost beautiful in its own way, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. The war was far from over, and the Armada would not rest until they had wiped out the human resistance. They had made their first move, and now humanity had to make theirs. "Captain," Commander Blake's voice broke through his thoughts. "We've received a signal from the rebel colonies. They're asking for reinforcements. They've heard about the battle." Hawk turned to her, his expression hardening. The rebel colonies had been fighting against the Armada's oppressive rule for years, and their efforts had been largely ignored. But now, with the destruction of the Armada's fleet, they had seen the spark of hope that humanity could win. The news of the Vanguard's victory would spread like wildfire, and it was only a matter of time before other colonies rose up against their oppressors. "Send a response," Hawk said firmly. "Tell them we'll be there soon. We've only just begun." Blake nodded, immediately sending the signal. Hawk turned back to the view screen, his gaze distant. The Armada had failed to break humanity, but that didn't mean they were done. They were powerful, relentless, and they would come again. But this time, humanity had the advantage. They had proven that they could stand against them, and the rest of the galaxy would now know what they were capable of. "Captain," Blake spoke again, this time with a note of urgency. "We've detected additional Armada forces approaching. Not a full fleet, but a sizable force. We're not out of danger yet." Hawk's lips pressed into a thin line. "How soon?" "Less than 12 hours, she replied. "They've likely been in deep space, preparing for something. They're aware of what happened here. They're coming to finish the job." Hawk nodded, his mind already working through the options. The Vanguard wasn't in any condition to face another full-scale battle, and their fleet was still far too small to take on the Armada directly. But there were other ways to fight. There were always other ways. "Prepare the ship for battle," Hawk ordered, his voice calm but commanding. "We'll meet them head-on, but we'll also prepare to strike at their supply lines. We'll hit them where it hurts. We've got to make them think twice before they come after us again." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting a counter-offensive?" Hawk gave her a small, determined smile. "Exactly. We're not just going to survive this war. We're going to win it. We've shown them that we're more than just a nuisance. We've shown them that humanity has a power they can't understand. Now, we take that power, and we use it." As Blake relayed the orders to the crew, Hawk's mind raced ahead. The Armada might have been a formidable opponent, but they had underestimated humanity's resilience, its ability to adapt and fight back. The war wasn't just about firepower. It was about spirit. And in that, humanity had a strength that no amount of advanced technology or overwhelming numbers could ever replicate. The Vanguard's engines hummed to life, once more as the ship powered up, its weapon systems reactivating with a low, menacing growl. The crew was ready, focused, and prepared. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. They had sent a message, one that would echo across the galaxy. The Armada had been defeated, but humanity would continue to rise, to resist, and to fight for its future. As the Vanguard moved toward its next mission, the crew knew one thing for certain. The fight for their survival wasn't over. But they would never stop fighting. Not until they had won.